Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the RLS Foundation's webinar titled Clinical Trials, What to Expect. My name is Carla Diezenkowski, and I'm the Executive Director of the RLS Foundation. The surge in the use of web-based programs during the COVID-19 health crisis has created a strain on the system. If you are experiencing technical difficulty, switch to the audio portion as it uses less bandwidth, and be sure that your webcam is turned off. We thank you for attending and appreciate your patience and understanding with any technical difficulties that may arise during today's webinar presentation. Before we begin, please be aware that all attendees will remain on mute during this hour. We thank you for the questions submitted with your registration. Today's presenter, Jordana Zakon, will answer as many questions as time allows following the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording. Jordana graduated from Washington University in St. Louis in 2020 with a major in studio art and psychology. She has been involved in research since 2018, studying personality and health in older adults as well as child brain development. She now works as a clinical research coordinator in Dr. Winkelman's sleep disorders clinical research program at Mass Gen. In this role, Jordana is passionate about assisting with clinical trials and gaining insight into patients' treatment history and symptom management of restless leg syndrome. She hopes to apply this knowledge and experience to a future career in medicine. Jordana, we invite you to go ahead and begin your presentation.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the RLS Foundation for hosting me today. Hi everyone, my name is Jordana Zakon, and as Carla mentioned, I'm the research coordinator in the Sleep Disorders Clinical Research Program at Massachusetts General Hospital, where I assist Dr. Winkelman with his clinical trials. Today, I'm going to be discussing what to know and expect as a participant in clinical research. And I just want to apologize in advance. I'm recovering from laryngitis right now, so my voice may be a little bit shaky at times. So first, a brief agenda. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview, including different types of clinical trials and different operational structures that you may encounter. I'll also walk through different components of clinical trials and tell you some things to consider while answering as many questions as you may have towards the end. So first, I'm going to review different types of clinical trials and what you may be asked to do as a research participant. So to start off, what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial examines the safety and effectiveness of a new medical technique in people. And a new technique can refer to a drug, medical device, psychotherapy, or physical therapy, or even a vaccine, as we've been hearing a lot about recently. And in this NIH definition, I just wanted to highlight a couple of points. So first, human subjects are involved in clinical research. And so clinical trials happen after the preclinical development phase, where drugs are tested on lab animals or tissue samples. And next, clinical trials involve interventions. So we're asking people to change something in their routine. And by contrast, an observational study happens when participants are observed with no intervention. And so one example that a lot of you may be familiar with or even involved in is the National RLS Opioid Registry. And in this study, we're following a group of patients who use opioids to treat their RLS. And so while we're not asking participants to use any particular medication or change their routine in any way, we're asking patients to report on changes in their opioid doses over time, changes in RLS symptom severity, sleep, mental and physical health, and opioid-related stigma. And by collecting this information over a long period of time, we're able to draw conclusions about how we can better predict causes for large dose increases and identify predispositions for greater symptom severity. Next, I just want to review some terminology that will come up when speaking about clinical trials. So first, placebo-controlled refers to when a treatment is compared to something that seems indistinguishable but has no active ingredient. And so this is to make sure that the treatment itself has efficacy and that has a more favorable outcome when compared to placebo. Next, in a double-blind trial, neither the participant nor the researcher knows if the participant is receiving experimental treatment or placebo. And this is important to prevent bias that can happen due to expectancy effects. For example, if a researcher knows that a patient is receiving active drug, they may frame their questions differently, inadvertently leading the patient to give a certain response. And similarly, if a patient knows that they're receiving active drug compared to placebo, they may try to find evidence that suggests that their condition is improving. And so placebo-controlled double-blind trials are considered the gold standard for clinical research because they allow us to make sure that our treatment is efficacious and that our results were found without bias. Next, in an open label trial, both the researcher and participant do know which treatment the participant is receiving. And you may be wondering why this is done when I just explained that double-blind trials are part of the gold standard for clinical research. But this can be important for comparing different kinds of treatments. So for example, we may have a patient who's experiencing joint pain, and we want to know whether a certain drug or physical therapy leads to better symptom management. And so in that case, we can't really blind someone to whether they're getting physical therapy or taking a drug at night. And so the participant will know what is going on, but these are still important trials for this comparison. Also, open label trials are used sometimes in extension studies, which occur after a clinical trial is concluded. So patients may be offered the opportunity to participate in an extension study in which they're aware of the treatment they're receiving. And that may make someone more willing to be involved in data collection long-term, since they are aware of what's happening. And this can provide useful information about the long-term efficacy and safety of a treatment. Next, I'm going to review the different types of clinical trials. So a phase 1 clinical trial usually involves under 100 healthy volunteers and lasts about several months. The main purpose here is to ensure safety and test dosage. And testing dosage is often done by dose ranging, meaning comparing different experimental doses to find the optimal one. Also, phase 1 trials are generally not randomized, meaning they could be influenced by some selection bias, and that's mainly why we're focusing on safety here as opposed to efficacy. Next, a phase 2 trial involves a few hundred patients that are usually the target population for the drug. So as opposed to using healthy volunteers like in a phase 1 trial, here we're really targeting the clinical population that we're interested in. And these are usually randomized and placebo-controlled because our goal here is to establish efficacy. Next, phase 3 trials involve hundreds to even thousands of patients and can take a few years to complete. The results of phase 3 trials are often used to apply for FDA approval, so this is a really important phase in drug development. And the purpose here is to further establish efficacy of the treatment and identify any side effects. And lastly, a phase 4 trial, also called post-marketing trials, are used to test the long-term effectiveness and optimal use for the drug, as well as finding other potential benefits that we may not have realized at first. So now I'm going to talk about some specific study designs. The first design I'm going to talk about is a parallel groups design. And so imagine we've identified a group of people here who are a good fit for our study. In a parallel group design, generally half our subjects will receive drug and half will receive placebo. And this process is called randomization and is conducted by a clinical trials pharmacy. Again, because we wouldn't want to introduce bias by having the research team select who's receiving drug versus placebo. So half of the participants are identified, and then half receive drug while half receive placebo. And while it may look like everyone is starting the study at the same time here, a lot of clinical research trials actually recruit on a rolling basis, meaning that people move through the study at their own pace. And so the pharmacy will randomize patients as they're enrolled, but they'll keep a list of who is randomized to which treatment so that we can ensure there's an even distribution. Next, in a crossover design, it'll start similarly to a parallel groups design, So again, we have our treatment group here, and half are going to active drug and half are randomized to placebo. However, in a crossover design, there are 2 treatment periods. So this first randomization is actually only treatment period 1. And then you'll see this crossover here, hence the name of the study design. And during the second treatment period, the patients who are receiving active drug the first time now receive placebo, and the patients that were receiving placebo the first time are now receiving active drug. And this design differs from a parallel groups design in a few ways. So it's important to keep in mind as a potential research participant that in a crossover study, you'll always receive the active treatment at one point, whereas in a parallel design, you only have a 50-50 chance of receiving active drug during the trial. This design also differs in that there's a washout period between the 2 treatments. And so generally this will be a couple of weeks, and it's to ensure that there aren't any residual drug effects for participants moving on to the placebo phase from the active drug phase. Something else to consider here is that these crossover design studies often last longer, and that's to accommodate the 2 treatment periods as well as the washout period. And enrollment here can also happen on a rolling basis. So again, while it looks like everything is done super neat and organized with everyone starting at the same time and crossing over at the same time, in reality, it happens on a rolling basis as well. So participants can start the study and move through the study at their own pace. And here are just a few different components of clinical trials and tasks that you may be asked to do. So the first is the study treatment, and to clarify again, this could refer to an experimental drug, but it could also be a therapy or a type of device. Next, attending study visits is useful to follow up on symptoms of the condition being treated, side effects, and you may also be asked to perform some cognitive or physical tasks depending on what the study is. Next, neuroimaging is a part of some clinical trials. So for example, PET scans, MRIs, EEGs, or skeletal x-rays could be used to track structural changes in the brain, activity in different regions, or something like tumor development. And all of these things are used to determine if a treatment is effective. Next, questionnaires are a part of almost any study, and these are really used for symptom tracking again. And in sleep research in particular, we use questionnaires a lot for something called sleep diaries, which are short surveys participants fill out in the morning, just reporting on their sleep the previous night. And this is really important to us because it allows us to compile data over time to get a really nice comprehensive understanding of someone's sleep patterns and habits. Next, activity tracking is used to get a sense of someone's exercise and or sleep patterns in the case of sleep research. So movement enables us to understand when someone is active or resting, and even understand the quality of their sleep related to how much they're moving around. And this makes sleep research really accessible, since we don't have to get patients to come into the lab for a full sleep study. We can send a watch to our participants and they can wear it at home, and then we receive the data. Lastly, biospecimen collection is a part of some research, and this could mean blood samples, hair, or saliva, and this is used to test concentrations of different biomolecules, such as cortisol, which is a biomarker of stress, or glucose, which is really important for testing blood sugar in diabetic patients. And biospecimen collection is used to make sure patients are safe, and also to give us another indication of if our treatment is working as expected. And often these different measures that I just talked about are compared to one another. So in sleep research, for example, we could compare sleep questionnaire data with activity tracking to get the most comprehensive understanding of someone's sleep. Or in another example, cortisol levels could be compared to a subject's subjective reporting of their stress. Next, I'm going to give you an idea of who is involved in clinical research. So the sponsor is responsible for initiating a clinical investigation. And so the sponsor will choose qualified investigators to conduct research. They will routinely monitor trials, report new discoveries and side effects to the appropriate agencies, for example, the FDA. And a sponsor could be a pharmaceutical company, a government agency, an academic institution, or even an individual. And so sometimes the sponsor and the principal investigator, also known as the PI, are the same person. However, this usually isn't the case. And the sponsor is generally providing funding for the study and may even be providing the drug as well. Next, the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, has the main purpose of ensuring that ethical research practices are taking place and that participants remain safe throughout a clinical trial. And the IRB is generally connected to the institution where the research is being done. However, in some rare cases where there are multiple sites, sometimes this isn't the case. The IRB is also there to make sure that the protocol is adhered to as planned, and they're also going to be reviewing any changes that the research team may need to make to the protocol throughout the study. And so really, the main thing here is ensuring safety and ethical practices. Next, the principal investigator, or the PI, supervises study execution and sometimes conducts part of the study, for example, clinical interviewing or collecting medical history. The PI is responsible for integrity in both data collection and analysis, and is generally also accessible to the participant or patient if something comes up. Next, the research team will be your main source of contact as a participant, and the research team is responsible for recruiting patients, screening for eligibility, and walking patients through different steps of a clinical trial. And then participants are, of course, an essential part of clinical research. And what we ask of participants is to just follow the study protocol as directed by the study team, and to be open and honest about any discomforts or adverse reactions they're experiencing throughout the study. As a participant, you'll likely have the most amount of contact with the research team, followed by the principal investigator. The IRB is also accessible to research participants, but that communication isn't as routine. Now I'm going to walk through the different steps of a clinical trial in some more detail. So a little overview here. Screening is generally the first step in a study, and it's done to make sure that interested potential study candidates meet eligibility criteria. Once that's confirmed, the consent process takes place, in which the research team will explain all study expectations, risks, and requirements, which will allow participants to make an informed decision about whether or not they do want to participate in the trial. And at this point, after consent is signed, that's when we consider someone enrolled in the study. Next, a baseline period is done in many studies, and this is to gain an understanding of the participant's starting point so that we have a point of reference for after the treatment is conducted, allowing us to assess any change due to the treatment. And this baseline period can be done using a variety of techniques like the ones I described earlier, including biospecimen collection, questionnaires, or activity monitoring. And so all of these steps occur before the treatment begins. So I'm going to just call this the pre-treatment phase. Next, at the point of randomization, the participant will get assigned to a treatment. And this is usually done by the clinical trials pharmacy. And depending on the type of trial, this could be randomization to drug versus placebo, drug versus another drug, or even different doses of the same medication. Next, checkups will routinely happen with the study physician and/or the research team, and this is done to give participants an opportunity to report side effects or anything else they may be experiencing during the study. And in response to what the participants report, the study doctor may tweak the medication dose as necessary. Lastly, surveys are done throughout the study to give us an understanding of how symptoms are progressing during treatment. And so these three components here occurred during the treatment period. So you can kind of see how a clinical trial is broken up into these two main phases. Next, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about the screening period of a clinical trial. So screening for a clinical trial has a few different purposes. First, we need to confirm the diagnosis. So it's important that we make sure that a patient actively has the condition that our treatment is intended to treat. And not only that, we want to make sure that other conditions that a participant may have do not pose any excess risk to them. So for example, if someone is undergoing cancer treatment or recovering from a recent surgery, we wouldn't want to add any complications if our trial is unrelated to what they're going through. We also need to make sure that there aren't any dangerous drug interactions between the study medication and the current medication protocol of a patient. And so that's why a pretty in-depth medical history and a clinical interview is done by a study doctor to make sure that safety is maintained throughout the study. And so after screening occurs, we may also have a baseline phase before enrollment, and that's to make sure that the severity of a patient's condition falls within study criteria. So it's important to know that a research team gets very specific approval to treat a certain severity of a condition. So for example, in our insomnia studies, having a diagnosis of insomnia is usually not adequate to allow someone to participate. We actually need to have very specific requirements met on how much sleep someone is getting and how that sleep is being interrupted. So that's why we'll generally have people do a couple of weeks of those sleep diary surveys to make sure that they fit our criteria as needed. And a screening period could last a few weeks, maybe even up to a month, to make sure that the symptoms fall within the appropriate range. And so, as this diagram below suggests, the screening process can have multiple phases, which get more and more specific and help us narrow down our participant pool. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the informed consent process. So informed consent, importantly, happens before any study intervention takes place. So while the screening period is done to make sure that participants are the right fit for us, consent is really to allow participants to decide if our study is the right fit for them. So before we can provide the study treatment, as a research team, we will give you a detailed account of what will happen throughout the study. So that includes providing relevant contact information for the research team, the principal investigator, and the IRB. They'll also include a list of risks and requirements, risks usually including previously reported side effects from the experimental drug. We'll also say what kind of compensation you can expect. So in some studies, there is financial compensation for participating, or you may get to keep a device that we give you for the study. It's also important to understand that as a research participant, you have permission to withdraw at any time. So even if you sign a consent form and initially agree to participate in clinical research, you can change your mind at any point and drop out of a study if you'd like to. Data privacy is also a very important part of the consent process. So we'll explain how your data will be used and if it will remain de-identified, meaning that your name, date of birth, social security number, and other relevant personal details are kept separate from your data and anything published. And we'll also make it clear who has access to your data. Next, of course, results are a really exciting and important part of clinical research. The research team is always very excited to get results from a study, and we often find that our participants are equally as excited to learn what we learned from the study. But it is important to note that gaining results takes some time. So, as I mentioned before, enrollment happens on a rolling basis a lot of the time. So if you can imagine, it's possible that you may finish a clinical trial months or even up to a year before the last patient begins. And after all the data is collected, which again can take months or years, the data must be analyzed, a manuscript needs to be prepared, and then it must be accepted by a scientific journal before it's made public. And if you're curious about what the status of the study is, that's generally routinely updated on clinicaltrials.gov. Some of you may be familiar with that website, but that's a really good resource as a participant if you're curious about the phase of a clinical trial, or even if you want to check and see if a clinical trial is still open to enrollment. You can also contact the research team, and they'll generally be able to give you an idea of when results can be expected. Although we need to wait for publication to give you direct results, we may be able to tell you your randomization status before results are published. So for example, if you benefited from one of the treatments that you received during a clinical trial, it's possible that a member of the research team may be able to tell you if you're receiving active treatment or placebo, or in the case of a crossover study, we may be able to tell you during which phase you are receiving active drug versus placebo. But of course, in cases of emergencies, if side effects are very severe, or if there is a severe adverse reaction, we can unblind research participants right away to make sure that the patient is treated promptly and appropriately. Now I'm going to talk about some things to consider when deciding if participating in a clinical trial is right for you. So like any decision in life, there are costs and benefits to consider. And so the costs of participating in a clinical trial include side effects from medication. Most of these will generally be reported, but it's possible that there are novel side effects that we're testing for. So there might be something that happens that we are not previously aware of. There's also the time commitment to consider. So for in-person studies or studies that require imaging, there's travel time, and also some imaging studies can be pretty lengthy, with MRI scans lasting a couple of hours. Next, there's just the general discomfort with imaging or biospecimen collection. So some imaging techniques require being in small, confined spaces, which may make some people uncomfortable, especially if you're claustrophobic. And biospecimen collection, like a blood draw, could just be uncomfortable because of the needles involved. A research team may also need you to require you to stop your current medication protocol. So in sleep research, if we're testing a novel insomnia drug and you're already taking an insomnia medication, we may need you to stop your medication even for a couple of weeks before you'd start the clinical trial, just to make sure that's washed out of your system. Lastly, treatment may not always be immediately available. So in clinical trials where there's an experimental treatment that is not yet FDA approved, it's possible that you'll try out a medication or a novel therapy and really like it, get a lot of positive benefit, but not have access to it immediately after the trial ends because it's not on the market yet. Alternatively, there are some important benefits to consider. So the main one is possible relief from the condition. So if we're testing, a drug for a condition that you may have, you could get immediate relief from the treatment that we're trying. People also benefit from physician consultations and just having more mindfulness of the condition when they're filling out surveys. There are also incidental findings during scans. So in MRI research, for example, if they find an issue or a structural abnormality in the brain that does not have to do with the research, they do have a responsibility to let you know as a research participant. So you can find out things about your health that way that you may not have known otherwise. Next, there's the compensation, which I will say varies a lot from study to study. Sometimes it's pretty minor and you'll just be compensated for your travel fees, but some studies pay up to thousands of dollars for research participants. And lastly, it's always nice to know that you're helping others in the future that suffer from the same condition. Next, I'm going to review some limitations of clinical trials. And so a problem well recognized in the RLS community is augmentation, or a worsening of symptoms that occurs after prolonged use of dopamine agonist medications. And so during early dopaminergic drug trials in the 1980s, it was found that dopamine agonist medications provided quick and thorough relief of RLS symptoms. So because of that, these medications became popular first-line treatments for RLS because of their overwhelming efficacy. However, By the mid-90s, research on augmentation was published, explaining the long-term effects of dopamine agonist medications on worsening RLS symptom severity. And so, of course, this is a limitation caused by the timeline of research. It's very costly and difficult to collect research over a long period of time. And unfortunately, that can really limit our findings and our knowledge of how a medication affects someone long-term. There's also experimenter bias to consider. So while we try to control for this with blind protocols, that's not always possible. For example, a case where you're comparing two different treatments, so like a physical therapy versus a medication, it's just not possible to blind the experimenter and patient to which treatment they're receiving, of course. Unsuccessful randomization is another limitation, and this is particularly relevant in small sample sizes where there may be an uneven distribution of participant characteristics. So for example, it could coincidentally happen that one group has way more women than men, or that one group has like an average age much higher than the other group. And this could just, introduce some bias into the study and lead to results that are not just due to a treatment versus placebo. Control over the administration of treatment is also important because in a clinical trial, patients are often being reminded of when to take the medication and followed up with consistently by the research team. And so once patients are using this treatment by themselves at home, it's possible that they're not following the protocol, the medication protocol as closely, and that could make the results vary, of course. Another example is in psychotherapy, factors such as a patient's relationship with the therapist, so that's often known as the therapeutic alliance, could greatly impact the success of treatment, and that's something that's very difficult to account for in a research setting. Lastly, I just want to talk about the generalizability of clinical trials. So many drugs historically have been primarily tested on white men. And in fact, a 2021 study published in JAMA Network examined all randomized clinical trials published in JAMA, The Lancet, and the New England Journal of Medicine in 2015, and then again in 2019. And this was done to assess changes in over that 4-year period. So of the 688 studies examined, only half of those reported the racial breakdown of participants. And of those that did report the racial breakdown, the median representation of white participants was 84% in 2015 and 77% in 2019. So there's clearly an overrepresentation of white people in clinical research, while Black patients accounted for less than 5% of the clinical trial participants in these studies. And so this is really important to note because people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds may present symptoms differently or even metabolize drugs differently. And while it's sometimes hard to recruit a very diverse sample, this just shows the importance of reporting the racial breakdown in clinical trials. And I was pretty surprised to read that result of only half of these studies reporting on that. Next, I just wanted to list some resources in case any of you are now interested in participating in clinical trials. So I mentioned clinicaltrials.gov earlier, and that's a really good resource because you can filter for different conditions, age ranges, and it'll also give you updated information about whether a study is currently in the enrollment phase, meaning they're actively recruiting new research participants. Another great resource for clinical trials are academic institutions. And so this is great because most academic institutions conduct research. And so you can always just go to your local institution's website and find their research page and see if any clinical trials relate to you. Same thing with research hospitals. There's always a lot of research going on. I know that from experience locally here at Mass General Hospital. And next, nonprofit organizations for specific conditions. For example, the RLS Foundation has been really helpful in getting the word out about our clinical trials. And so that's just another resource. And lastly, it's a good idea to talk to your doctor if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, as they may be conducting their own research or have colleagues that are conducting research that you may be eligible for. And then here are some references I used for the presentation. And lastly, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Hey, well, thank you so much. That was very informative, and I learned a lot myself. We'll go ahead and start with the Q&A. First question is, are there any clinical trials available in the Philadelphia area?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Clinical trials are being conducted all over the country. I don't personally know of any, and our clinical trials aren't recruiting from Philadelphia right now, but I do recommend looking into academic institutions in that area. So University of Pennsylvania and Temple University, for example, I know are both conducting research all the time. So I would look into that, or your local doctor.
Great. Are you considering adding clinical trial sites for your studies in other parts of the country?
Yeah, so right now, because a lot of our studies are being done remotely, we're lucky enough to be able to recruit all over New England and California. But that's the limit as of right now, just because there are certain licensing restrictions. But if you live in California or anywhere in the New England area, we'd be happy to have you in any of our remote clinical trials, like the one I just mentioned before.
Great. How can I be part of a clinical trial if I'm not near any doctors involved in the trial?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So reaching out to a doctor is one way to get involved. But as I said, a lot of our clinical trials we're able to do entirely remotely right now, which is really exciting. And I know since the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of other research teams have moved to fully remote studies as well. So I would recommend probably looking into other institutions around the country, or even just like doing a Google search, typing in the condition that you have that you're interested in doing research for, and just seeing what comes up. And usually a study will indicate pretty quickly if it's a fully remote trial. So you don't necessarily have to be located somewhere where clinical research is being conducted.
Here's the next question. I was recently turned down for a clinical trial. I believe it might be because of my health condition. What does this mean?
Yeah, so again, I wouldn't take that too personally. Clinical trials are very strict in their recruiting guidelines and their eligibility criteria. So just because your condition made you ineligible for one study doesn't necessarily mean it'll make you ineligible for all studies. But if you find that it's like a recurrent theme that's coming up when you try to apply for trials, I would just mention that up front so they can tell you right away if you might not be a good fit for that particular trial.
Okay. If you're already on a medication regimen that works well or not so well, can you still be considered for a trial?
Yeah, absolutely. So often, for example, observational studies may be curious in understanding how your current regimen is going, or how you're feeling on that current regimen. If you wanted to get involved in a clinical trial specifically, it's possible that the research team may ask you to stop your current regimen to get a clean baseline period where you're off any medication for that condition for a while. And then they'll give you, the study medication or a placebo. And yeah, so that definitely won't make you ineligible for clinical research, but you may have to change up your routine a bit.
Okay. Should I apply even if the synopsis indicates I have a condition or medication which excludes me?
That's a tricky one to answer. So generally, if it's something very clear, like it says, for example, people with migraines can't participate. If you have migraines, I wouldn't end up applying. But if it's something like a medication you're taking that you're able to stop, for example, we don't allow patients taking sleep medications to participate in our insomnia trials. However, we're willing to let them join if they're willing to stop for a period of time. So I would think about whether the condition is something malleable or if you're flexible in whatever that criterion is.
What's the process for being chosen to take part in a clinical trial?
Yeah, so I touched on this a bit before, but the screening process is what will happen to allow us to determine if you're appropriate for a clinical trial. So different things you may be asked to do is attend study visits. So a clinical interview with a study doctor relates to pretty much any trial. And you may have to do some biospecimen collection or fill out some surveys, and that will help us determine if you're an appropriate fit.
Perfect. I appreciate you repeating that because we had like 25 people come on since the start, and I wanted to make sure we caught everyone. The next question is, how do adult and pediatric clinical trials differ?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I was involved with pediatric research and adult research. So what I would say the biggest difference is that as a child, you'll need your parents to consent to the trial as well. And often parents are the ones that see the trial and want to get their kids involved. So it's really that there's like this added factor of the parent being involved with the child. So we're not always working just one-on-one with the child. We're not communicating or scheduling with the child. So as long as the parent is willing to be involved and, you know, driving their kid back and forth, if the trial involves in-person visits, I would say that's the main difference.
And there's one listed on our website if you're interested, and I think it does have a remote possibility as well. But, you know, I encourage everyone to take a look at our website and clinicaltrials.gov. I noticed I was on yesterday looking up something for someone who had emailed me, and you can actually specify, you know, the state or even the country. So I didn't see that pull down bar previously. So that was a nice treat to see. So when people are looking to find something, you know, in their area, they might be able to find that clinical trial. But I think we had the list, and then one other question is what clinical trials are available for the treatment of RLS that are ongoing? Do you know? I know we've got them listed on our website, clinical trials. Any other places that we should encourage people to look?
Yeah, I would say look at clinicaltrials.gov and filter by RLS. And then I think you can also filter for studies that are open to enrollment, and that'll give you a sense of what's going on that you can still get involved in. Because for example, the RLS registry study is something that's ongoing, but we're no longer recruiting patients for that. So you'll want to make sure that the trial is still enrolling if you apply.
All right, well, thank you everyone for taking time today, and for you, Jordana. And if I feel bad you have you're recovering from laryngitis and doing this webinar. We had a great group of people join us this afternoon, and I hope everyone has an enjoyable rest of their day.